The Global Development Policy Center here at Boston University, and welcome to the last of the semester's Global China Research Colloquium that we have here at the GDP Center. The GDP Center is a policy-oriented research institute at Boston University that focuses on financial stability, human well-being, and the environment. And one of our signature programs is called the Global China Initiative that looks at the overseas social, environmental, and economic impacts of China's overseas economic activity. We've had 13, I think, wonderful seminars this semester. And before I introduce today's topic and today's speaker, I just want to invite everyone to an encore performance that we're going to have tomorrow. Today was the last scheduled seminar, but tomorrow at 9:30, the GDP Center will be launching a new interactive web page that spatially locates all of China's overseas development finance by project geographically across the world, and allows one to overlay the extent to which those projects are proximate to biodiversity areas and indigenous lands. You got a sneak peek, for those of you who've been coming to the seminar every Wednesday, you got a sneak peek of some of the analysis that GDP Center researchers have been doing with these data. But tomorrow we launch a interactive web page where folks can go and play and interact with that data themselves. And in early 2021, it'll be freely available for download for folks as well. So if you look in the chat, you can see a link to that. Please come register and join us tomorrow. I'm really excited to introduce my colleagues that I've been working with for a number of months now, who are going to present to you a paper in progress that looks at the local environmental impacts and social impacts of a Chinese finance coal plant in Pakistan. The name of their paper, at least in progress, is The Social Costs from Chinese Finance Coal Power Plants, a case study of PM 2.5 health risks under compliance and non-compliance scenarios for the Port Qasim electric power plant in Pakistan. The presenters and authors of this study are Arden Radford, a PhD student here at Boston University's Department of Earth and Environment and a Global China Fellow here at the GDP Center; Jeffrey Geddes, an atmospheric chemist who's at the BU Department of Earth and Environment; and Bruce Larson, a economist at the Boston University School of Public Health. The way these seminars go, these folks will speak for 25 to 30 minutes, and then I will take questions and answers from those of you in the attendance. If you look at the bottom right-hand corner of your Zoom link, you'll see a little Q&A box. So please put your name and affiliation there so we can all get to know each other, and then place your question in there. After these folks are done with their presentations, I'll read to them your questions, and we'll go back and forth for a few rounds until the top of the hour. So let me share my screen, and we'll start the presentation.
Kevin, can you put it in presenter mode, please?
Yeah.
Right.
Kevin, if you there should be an option to switch the way that the presentation is shown so that we don't see the presenter mode.
Kevin, do you have two
Does that work? Computer freeze here. Let's try one more time.
What about if you hit swap displays? Do you have two?
It's just excuse me, everyone. I'm just having a computer freeze here. Let's try one more time. okay?
No,
You see that?
Kevin,
No?
if you have two displays connected, there we go. That's what
Perfect.
we're looking for. So you can go to the
There we
next
go.
slide.
Okay,
Please.
sorry about that, folks.
That's right. Okay, next slide, please. Can Kevin hear me? Arden, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Is Kevin's computer? Perhaps I should be made a co-host so that I can manage the slides. Oh, there we go. Okay. Okay, so we're going to begin. We're too many slides ahead now. Kevin, can you go to slide?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I froze. Can you hear me? My computer is just freezing up. I'm not sure why. Let me try one more time here. I might have to hand it over to somebody else.
Yeah, why don't you just hand it over to me and we'll get going. Who?
Thank you for the patience, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for the patience, everyone. It takes us, we've been doing this clean for 13 weeks. All right. How's this?
Now go back to swap screens. Okay, why don't I share my screen so we can move on?
Okay, yeah, I'm sorry. I just stopped shared. My computer is just freezing up. Sorry, folks. 13 weeks. We've had no problems, and now I'm in bad shape here. Can you just take over from here, Bruce?
Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen.
Yes.
And we're moving on to the second. So for our introduction, we all know that an adequate supply of electricity is important for economic growth and just for our basic economic lives. We're all sitting around in offices right now benefiting from good electricity supply, I suspect. To date, many coal-fired power plants have been linked to the Belt and Road Initiative, and we know the contributions to global externalities from coal-fired power plants are fairly clear. So our focus today is on local externalities from coal-fired power plants, and in particular, PM 2.5 emissions. So why are we focusing on local externalities? Well, in most countries, the host governments or the domestic environmental authorities are responsible for implementing domestic environmental laws and regulations. In the planning phase, before the projects have been constructed, environmental impact assessments play a key role in identifying and mitigating primarily domestic environmental impacts of these proposed investments, such as power plants. There's been discussion about possible pollution halo effects arise if BRI-related investments are implemented in areas where with weaker environmental policies or weaker enforcement than in China proper. And for example, a recent review of EIA-related legislation and policies in 64 countries related to the Belt and Road Initiative identified numerous countries having weaker policies than China, particularly around EIA regulations. So we're going to focus on local externalities and in particular PM 2.5. So PM 2.5 is very tiny particulate matter, less than 2.5 microns in diameter. We focus on PM 2.5 because it's a known important cause of mortality risk worldwide. Perhaps a recent estimate of over 4 million deaths worldwide in 2015. In Southeast Asia, a recent study of emissions from numerous coal-fired power plants estimated about 20,000 excess deaths in 2011 conditions, and they expect these to grow to perhaps 70,000 due to expected expansion of power plants and growth in the population by 2030. There's also very well documented relationships between PM 2.5 concentrations and specific diseases by age and concentration level. So we have very good relationships between ambient concentrations and health risks. So we're going to focus our analysis on a case study of the Port Qasim power plant just outside of Karachi, Pakistan. We focus on this power plant for a few reasons. First, it exists. It was constructed in 2014 and electricity generation began in 2018. The information I could dig up was that they have produced about 4 billion kilowatt hours of electricity in the first half of 2020 with revenues of about 300 million. The power plant was financed largely by the Export-Import Bank of China. It's located about 40 kilometers southeast of Karachi, Pakistan, with a metro population of 16 million or so. So the possibility exists of a large local population that might be affected by plant emissions. Also, while an environmental impact assessment report exists for the power plant, it turns out the report's not publicly available. However, from the available information we do have, we know that the plant was created with very modern production and pollution control technologies. So we have a modern facility with substantial efforts directed towards minimizing environmental problems, at least based on the planning documents and what was constructed. Also, we do this case study because we wanted to develop a case study where we could use open source data and an open source approach for completing this analysis that can really be replicated in any setting for essentially any point source pollution setting. Could be BRI related or not, it could be coal-fired power plants or not, but it's a fairly generalizable approach. Our main findings is that first, our open source approach is feasible and consistent with analyses relying on more proprietary data and proprietary modeling results that are sometimes inserted into EIA documents, but the underlying analysis is not available. We know that Port Qasim is a plant with modern technologies and functioning pollution control technologies. And in this case, with these modern technologies, we are pretty confident that they impose little social costs in terms of PM 2.5 health risks. But if these environmental pollution control technologies, particularly electrostatic precipitators, ESPs, if they're not maintained or simply turned off, then there could be important health risks to local populations. In our study location, we would estimate an additional 49 deaths annually in the absence of functioning electrostatic precipitators. And that would add up to 500 people over 10 years. In terms of social costs, we convert this into, based on value statistical life, the equivalent of about $29 per person in the affected population. The focus here is on ages 25 to 84. And this is in a region where the median income per capita is in the range of $400 to $500. So it's not a relatively inconsequential effect. So our approach proceeds in 4 stages. We have to think in terms about air dispersion modeling, the population exposed, the health risks from the concentrations created by the factory, and these health risks in terms of additional mortality risks. And we convert these mortality risks into social costs, a non-monetary version based on disability adjusted life years lost, and a monetary version based on social willingness to pay to reduce mortality risks, which is also known as value statistical life. Now, we're going to talk about air dispersion modeling next, and my colleague Arden Radford is going to take over from here. Arden, if I can keep pushing through the slides.
Perfect. Thanks, Bruce. I guess next slide then. All right, so the question is why did we use the Airmod dispersion model? Airmod is a steady state Gaussian plume model that incorporates planetary boundary layer behavior. It's already commonly used for air quality assessments in the United States, as well as a growing number of other countries. And importantly about this is the base software for running these models is freely available on the EPA SCRAM website, which is a regulatory and monitoring hub for the EPA. Next slide. So what I'm going to do here is go over our Airmod kind of dispersion process and the various steps. There are 2 steps, a preprocessor for map and terrain data, as well as setting a receptor network, meteorological variables of the atmosphere and our source, And then once again, I want to stress the key and novel part of our study and paper was that we used open source data and managed to get that to marry and work with this processor to create our dispersion model. So I'll be going over these steps a bit more in depth. Next slide. So in the discussion of sources, Bruce mentioned that it's for point sources. Airmod can also be used in a lot of broader applications too for like line and areas, either looking at the impacts of transportation networks or larger factories, landfills and stuff on air pollution. And so with this, we'll skip into talking about more information about the Port Qasim power plant. Next slide. So on the left here, we have a photo of the Port Qasim power plant in Karachi, Pakistan, as well as an inset photo of a coal power plant in the United States, which tends to have a much older capital stock. So information that we were needed for modeling included stack height and stack diameter, which is that red and white stripe stacked in the photo. And we were able to get that from technical specifications on the power plant or accessible information. However, some of the information required for modeling, as we mentioned, the EIA is not publicly accessible, so we had to approximate that. So things like flue gas temperature, gas exit velocity, and the PM 2.5 flow rate. What we did is we looked for EIAs of comparable power plants using similar technology and similar fuel that were proposed in the region to approximate those values. Some additional information about the power plant is it is two 660 megawatt supercritical boilers. As we mentioned, has very modern pollution controls and the uses of electrostatic precipitators and flue gas desulfurization. Next slide. So now that we understand the source of our power plant, the question is what's our domain area? What's the terrain like? And how do we set up our way of measuring concentration at the surface? So this is where the Airmap preprocessor comes in. And this is where we used our open source SRTM data, which I will now explain in the next slide. So SRTM stands for the Shuttle Radar Topography Mission. This was a shuttle mission back in 2000s with basically the goal of creating a near global digital elevation model of the world. This is at a 30-meter spatial resolution of telling information about the height of the terrain. And on the right, we can see that basically this is a map of where there's data accessible freely for download off the USGS Earth Explorer website. Next slide. So what does this data exactly look like? So on the left-hand side here, we see these kind of smaller 4 images. What here, black means a low elevation, white means high. So in this case of this first image up front, that's basically looking at some estuaries and rivers, as well as some hills and mountains. So what I did was I downloaded all of this data, merged it together using a data library called GDAL, which is just a free geospatial data analysis library to create one nice big mosaic image to feed into Airmap, which is we see on the right. That blue box there represents our study domain. So within that area, I placed effectively a receptor cell at every kilometer to give us an understanding of what the concentration at that point is at the surface. And just for reference, the blue star represents where our power plant and source is. Next slide. So we're already kind of 2/3 of the way there. We understand our source, we understand where our domain is and what's happening on the ground there. The question now is, how is the atmosphere behaving to disperse the PM 2.5 in the region? So I'll now be discussing the Airmat processor, basically the meteorological processor. It takes weather data, and this is where we're going to be talking about the GEOS FP model, which I'll explain more. But basically, Airmat requires the hourly surface data as well as a daily profile. So information about every hour, about temperature, wind direction, cloud cover, and then once a day, understanding how the atmosphere behaves as you move up. Next slide. So just kind of for reference, this is a map of basically locations that have hourly and sub-hourly observational data for uses in meteorological modeling like Airmod. For the Northeast, I live in the Boston area, so if I wanted to do something similar for around Boston, I'd have a lot of sources to use. Now, we're not looking at the Northeast United States. We're not looking at Boston. Next slide. So we're looking to do a study in Pakistan and in the Karachi region. So there are international sources globally of this ISD, what's known as ISD hourly data. Once again, the blue star represents our source. The situation comes is that unfortunately, a lot of these observations maybe have only 10 a day or 12 or 22, and we need 24 hours of observations for multiple years. So we have gaps in our data. And the question is how do we fill those gaps? Next slide. So a lot of times what we do to fill those gaps in data is use what's called a regional mesoscale meteorological model, which can fill these gaps. A lot of times, the cartoon on the left here kind of shows how they work. It's basically modeling a land, ocean, atmosphere interaction in these smaller kind of grid boxes and recording what's happening in those. Think about what we use for either hurricane forecasting, weather forecasts. It's those sort of models. And there already exist models that are coupled with Airmod, which are basically MM5 and the weather research and forecasting model known as WRF. But these are both computationally and very financially expensive to run. So if we're looking at an open source practice that could be easily applicable anywhere in the world, this is not the best option. So what we choose to use was GeosFP, which is a meteorological data product available online for free at an hour resolution that's updated in near real time. Next slide. So what we see here is a combination of what kind of like a weather forecast of one of the variables I used in my analysis. So GeosFP is a NASA data product. This right here is showing relative humidity approximately at the surface level. Once again, blue star shows what our region is. And this is actually a weather model output from just 2 days ago. So once again, it's updated very recently and it keeps kind of accurately data. So what happens on the left is showing our kind of process of basically downloading the data from our location. So we're only looking for data that feels for our power plant. We then take it and get the variables, do some calculations to understand like what's required for our data products. After getting this data and transforming into the proper files, we then output that into formats that Airmod will use. Then we'll have 2 effective 3-year timescales to run our model with. Next slide. So now we have our source specified. We have a domain and grids to understand and monitor our concentrations. We now have our meteorological information tells how the plume is going to behave. We can finally run the dispersion model with our open source data. Next slide. So I'll briefly discuss some of the plumes and Airmod results we got from our modeling. Next slide. So what's being shown here is a combination of a few different types of data. We have population density data, we have a kind of satellite imagery of Karachi, but importantly, we have these contour lines. These contour lines are showing the additional concentration of on an annual average of PM2.5 due to the power plant, which is that black dot. And we can see that very close to this power plant, around 2 kilometers to the northeast, we're seeing high concentrations. In this situation, this is when there's no ESP being done. So that's looking at 10, 12, up to 21 micrograms per cubic meter. And as that basically, these concentrations fall off as the plume disperses. Next slide. Now, what's happening here is it's a very similar looking figure. We have the similar looking contour, same population, but this case is being what is happening when ESP and other these pollution controls are being run and maintained consistently. As we can see, we went from 12, 10 to 20 to 0.05, 0.04, 0.01 to effectively 0 concentration. So with this, I'm going to pass this back to Bruce so he can start talking about how we merge this plume data with population for analysis.
Okay, great. Thanks, Arden. So as Arden already showed in this figure that we have population density information in our analysis that is taken from the gridded population of the world. It's a 1 by 1 kilometer population density. And our focus of our study is on population ages 25 to 84, based on prior literature in terms of those are the ages that are at particular risk from health risk from PM2.5 concentrations. So we take the estimate of the population in each one square kilometer grid. We use the Pakistan 2017 census to come up with the Pakistan age distribution. And from that, we can estimate the population size by age category in each 1 by 1 kilometer cell. Unfortunately, the Karachi sits in Sindh province, and while the census will have population age distribution specifically for Sindh province at some point, those data haven't been reported yet. But this information could be updated when those data become available. So in terms of PM2.5 health risks, which health risks are we talking about? For adults, we're going to be talking about stroke, heart disease, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Those are the 3 diseases we focus on. Some other literature has also included lung disease, but for various reasons, we decided not to include that here because incidence was relatively quite low. So we have to have these 3 diseases. And then as a starting point, we need to know, well, what is the annual incidence of these diseases by age category in Pakistan? Well, it turns out the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, the people that sort of house the global burden of disease world, you can download from their data the disease incidence by age category for essentially almost any country in the world. So that's where we got the disease incidence from Pakistan. And it's important to remember that disease incidence data that exists right now, the incidence that exists has contributions from Port Qasim power plant already built into that incidence. So we'll have to take that into account in our next steps. So just for perspective, what do health risks from PM2.5 look like based on age and different disease categories? So if you look, the horizontal axis is PM2.5 concentrations. And those two dashed black lines are between 20 and 40 micrograms per cubic meter annual average. On the left-hand axis, the vertical axis, relative risks start at 1, essentially no additional risk, and relative risks increase up to 1.8, which would mean 80% higher risk than without concentrations. And so these lines are increasing and sort of concave, but they're concave at very low levels, kind of 10 micrograms, 15 micrograms perhaps. But once you get up into the 10 to 40 range, each of these relationships by disease, by age, are relatively linear. And if you look at the green line is the relative risk for stroke for a 30-year-old. So at 40 micrograms, that relative risk is 2.4. That means it's 2.4 times the risk of what it would be if the concentrations were down to a really low level. If you look at the blue line, that's the relative risk for stroke for a 65-year-old. So what's interesting is the relative risk for a 65-year-old look lower than the relative risk for a 30-year-old. But the base underlying incidence is much lower for a 30-year-old. So having a higher relative risk when the risk itself is low is taken into account in our analysis. So also we highlight this 20 to 40 microgram region because that's a region that's probably relevant for the world that we're talking about in Pakistan. For example, we looked at hourly weather hourly PM2.5 monitoring in Karachi, Pakistan. It turns out the US EPA puts air monitoring stations in consulates and embassies around the world. So at the US consulate, in months 1 through 11 of this year, 1 January, 11 November, monthly average concentrations based on 24-hour hourly readings were in the 70 range in January and February, down to 40, down to 25 range from April through September, which is a rainy season. I guess the implication being that the rain's sort of knocking the stuff out of the air. And then in October and November, concentrations increased dramatically again. For reference, the Pakistan National Ambient Standard for PM2.5 is 15, that dashed black line. So Pakistan itself, Karachi itself is, at least in this station reading, is persistently above national standards. So now we have all the pieces of our puzzle ready to go to estimate the change in mortality risks from concentrations attributed to the Port Qasim power plant. In the black box in the middle is the PM2.5 concentrations for each cell, each grid cell, one kilometer square cell in our analysis from the air dispersion modeling. So we have the change in concentrations from the power plant. We have the population by age in each cell, in the green box from our prior information. We have our underlying disease incidence for the different diseases and the relative risks based on the ambient concentrations from the red boxes. And basically we can put these pieces of information together into one simple equation that comes from prior analyses of mortality risks from ambient PM2.5, this APTI 2015 paper that we can pass along the reference. And basically the change in mortality risk is just in each cell I, for each age and for each disease, we just need the population in that cell of that age. We need the underlying disease incidence, that I0, that would exist if the PM2.5 concentrations were essentially down to 0 or almost 0 to where they would cause no effect. So we can't just take the actual incidence that we observe. We have to take that actual incidence and back out what that incidence would be in the absence of any PM2.5 concentration health effects. And then we just multiply that by the relative risk of concentrations if the factory did not exist, CRI, and the relative risk if the factory did exist, because it does exist. Now, We don't have exactly monitored emission ambient concentrations for each of our grid cells, but we're fairly confident that the range of 20 to 40 micrograms per cubic meter annual average is in the realm of reasonable based on monitoring data from Karachi and based on information from the more global assessments of PM 2.5 health risks that put Pakistan in that medium concentration level. I believe it was 25 to 40 micrograms per cubic meter. So we chose 40 for CNI. We chose 40 micrograms per cubic meter as our reference point. If anything, that is a bit high, we would argue. So therefore, our risk that we estimate would be conservative, perhaps a bit on the low side. From that change in mortality risk, we can then convert that into disability adjusted life years lost, essentially life years lost in this case, based on from that blue box on the right, we can go to the WHO life tables to get age-specific life expectancy. And from that, we can come up with daily estimates per age. And we can use recent estimates on the value of statistical life from many countries around the world, including Pakistan, to convert mortality risk into social costs in terms of a monetary equivalent. So our main results are in the left-hand table for mortality risk. Essentially, the Port Qasim power plant with functioning electrostatic precipitators have essentially no health risks, no mortality change in the population. Without the electrostatic precipitators, however, then we're going to get some mortality risks, mainly through heart disease and stroke, that we estimate to be 49 people, an increase in mortality risk equivalent to 49 additional deaths in a population of cells that had an effect from this factory of at least 1 microgram per cubic meter change in PM 2.5. That part of the study is 400,000 population of people aged 25 to 84. In our overall study region, I think our population is slightly over 1 million at this age category. We convert those into DALYs lost and social costs. This would be about 700 DALYs annually in the right-hand table. And in terms of total social costs, in terms of value statistical life, be about $12 million, which converts into about $29 per person aged 25 to 84 in a study region where annual populations or annual income is around $400 to $500. So we're going to end here now. Sorry, we took a little extra time. So our final remarks are basically that our open source is feasible. All the data and code that we've put together for this analysis are going to be put into an open BU data repository for anyone to use. Our approach allows third parties, such as local governments, non-governmental organizations, to replicate analyses in basic EIAs, and or to replicate this type of analysis for factories that are ongoing and perhaps are older capital stock, perhaps more polluting. Our analysis basically highlights the importance of continued compliance and enforcement of environmental regulations. This has historically been an issue in many countries, including the US, for example, as well as Pakistan. And our open source approach is applicable globally. I think we're going to end here and it'll be time for questions. So I really appreciate, this is a product of work of Professor Geddes, Professor Gallagher, Arden Radford, and myself. So I appreciate everyone's contributions, and Kevin and Jeffrey will be happy to answer all of your questions.
Thanks a lot, folks, and sorry for some technological difficulties on my end in the beginning. I guess my computer's ready for a holiday break here at Boston University, but it looks like I'm back in action. Well, we have over 50 participants here, and I just want to remind folks that you can go into the Q&A box down in the right-hand corner. Please introduce yourself and ask a question. We've got 3 to start that I'll start with the folks, and then we can do other rounds. The first one is from Catherine Adene. She's director of the Asia Research Institute at the University of Nottingham. And she says, while it's reassuring to hear that you think that the modern technologies involved in this plant minimize the danger to the local population, but why then not make the EIA public? Victoria Chone, who is a PhD student at the University of Southern California and a GCI fellow here, says, thank you. Echoing Catherine's question above, is there any reason why the EIA is not public? Is this due to weak local enforcement or lack of relevant policies? What would be the implication for transparency, especially for a plant that does not seem to have much to hide in regards to its local social impacts? We have another from Yangisu Liu. Yangisu Liu is from the University of Oxford and asks, would the 1 kilometer be a bit small for studying air pollutant exposure for the population in that cell, as people may move across cells? So why don't we take those three, and feel free, any of the paper authors, to jump in on those, and then we can take another round. Folks in the audience, just go into the Q&A button, introduce yourself, ask a question, and we'll take those in another round. Who wants to jump in on any of those?
Okay, I'll jump in on the EIA topic, and Kevin, maybe you can help me out here. I don't know why the EIA is not easily available, because it's discussed in other documents, so other people have been able to somehow get the EIA. My guess is the EIA, this factory is, the EIA is probably from 2014, started maybe in 2013. It could just be an artifact of history where people just weren't it wasn't as obvious to put things online. I know that the same company that did EIAs did an EIA for another power plant that was going to be built right next door, and that one is publicly available. So my guess is it's a little bit of oversight, nothing specifically nefarious, but I could be wrong. There's another part of the EIAs, even when EIAs are available, it's typical that they may report the results of some underlying modeling that is done using proprietary data or proprietary methods by some other organization. And so the results are reported, but the details are not. So Jeffrey or Arden, please clarify if I'm wrong there.
Thanks. Okay. I'll chime in on that a little bit. We here at the GDP Center, we have two different databases of Chinese overseas energy finance. One's called the China's Global Energy Finance Database, and then the other one called China's Global Power Database, which is sort of the origin of the work that we have here. And we should note that there are numerous places in Pakistan where you can find the EIAs for some of these other plants. So it's not something that's uniform across Pakistani environmental policy. But this one is not public, and we've engaged with a number of civil society organizations, engaged with the government and so forth, and have in a specific request to the government that we wrote a note asking for it, and haven't been able to get this particular one. Not so sure. I think it sort of underscores two of the main findings from this paper. One is that we worked really, Professor Geddes, Arden, Bruce Larson. These folks are advancing methodologies in their disciplines at the frontier. But we went out of our way to make this user-friendly and open access, so that civil society organizations, local governments, and so forth can do this kind of work in the absence of government transparency and government regulation, which has been in numerous World Bank reports and other and local lawsuits. That's been one of the core concerns about Pakistani air pollution policy. They have a lot of great policies on the books, but they're very inconsistent with respect to publishing EIAs and with respect to enforcement of the end-of-pipe technologies that are required under many of these plants. And that's why we did these two different scenarios. Scenario one, plant could be relatively benign with respect to PM 2.5. We don't look at water, and obviously CO2 is a whole other story. But if those regulations are not enforced and the ESPs are not being operated, we outline some real concerns. So one of the key messages here is user friendliness for transparency and accountability, and number two, the need to act with this transparent information to make sure that governments and firms are held accountable to make sure that these end-of-pipe technologies are actually used. I don't know if my colleagues want to respond to some of the other questions.
I can chime in on the Yangtze Yu's question, which I think is excellent in terms of representing real exposure as people move around. I think the solution to that is not modeling a bigger cell, but trying to know where people move throughout their day. And that's very difficult, obviously, to capture. People who live in an area of impact might work in an area outside of that impact, or people that live outside of the impact might work in an area of impact. But I think we want to preserve the high fidelity of the plume characteristics, which is why we would model at a fine scale. And ideally, we would want to then, capture how many hours people sort of move around in different parts of that map. But I'm not familiar with, anyone who has done that with, a plume model output. But there are new studies following people and tracking their exposure changes as they, are indoors, outdoors, commuting to work, at work. But it's an excellent question and a very difficult one to get at.
Yeah, and also we would have to go back into the underlying studies that were used to create the relative risk curves, because in those underlying studies, they were based on location of people's, I believe, living location. So those risks sort of already integrated the fact that they weren't 24 hours a day necessarily in that same exposure. So I think some of that movement would have already been sort of incorporated into the underlying relative risk curves, but we'd have to go back into the underlying assumptions. Just like we know that, if people are living in an exposed region, but they have good air conditioning in their house that has a good filter, it's not going to be the same as if they're outside. But I think the relative risk curves are based on annual average exposures. Doesn't necessarily mean you were breathing that exactly on average 24 hours a day for the whole year.
Great, here's a couple more questions here. We have one from Roxanne O'Connor. Were any non-air pollutants measured, such as water? Coal plants dispose of heavy metals like selenium, mercury, arsenic, cadmium, thallium, and lead into our waterways, polluting our drinking water, fishing areas, and local rivers and streams. And we have a question from our colleague here at BU's Barty School of Global Studies, who's done a book on the BRI. She says, how has the policy discussion on this issue? Pakistan is debated between electricity and health, and it chose electricity first. Any detectable change after COVID as countries are becoming more health and green conscious? Let me see if I have another one in the chat here. Folks, please, you can, we have one from Shoaib Kahoot from Pakistan, similar to the others. He says, is it the weak environmental policies on the Pakistani end which are detrimental here? Or is it just the fact that they're coal-fired power plants? There's three questions for the moment.
So I can address a couple questions about other pollutants, and we clearly focused on PM2.5 because of the known contribution of PM2.5 to mortality risk globally, and a solid relationship between ambient concentrations and relative risks. We do know the point about water is very well taken. It turns out for Port Qasim power plant, they take water, because Pakistan in this area is a relatively dry region, they actually take water out of the ocean sitting next door. They have a desalinization plant that's part of the factory. So they create fresh water and use that for cooling. So they're not drawing on, for example, groundwater sources, which might be the case in other power plants. In terms of heavy metals and things like mercury, I'm very much not an expert, but from what I've read with supercritical boilers, the temperature at which the burning occurs is relatively low, so that you're not getting mercury emissions into the air and it's staying in the, forgive me, I may be wrong here, the ash that is collected, that of course would then need to be dealt with. And cadmium and other pollutants I can't respond to, but that's very much the case. So this is not a full assessment of all local externalities. It's a case study of one important one, but these others would be a perfectly good area for future research.
Any other thoughts, colleagues?
I mean, even on top of that, like Bruce said, we only picked one pollutant as well, and there's probably other air pollutants even that we could model from the power plant emissions. But PM 2.5 was a good one to start with, as it probably is, might have the largest signal in terms of local problems.
Yeah, if I could put in a plug. So last week we had a presentation from Mir Alkan, one of our postdoctoral fellows here, and he actually has published a paper. I'll read it out and stick it in the chat. He's written a paper called "Water Security Implications of Coal-Fired Power Plants Through China's Belt and Road Initiative," which it's published in Energy Policy in September of 2019, that looks at some of the water issues, a little bit more on water supply issues rather than some of the pollution-based issues. Again, there's a lot of research on the climate change implications of Chinese overseas coal-fired power plants. Maybe we'll drop in the chat a paper that we published with some former fellows here who are PhD students at Princeton, where we estimate the CO2 emissions from all of these overseas plants. And this Mayor Alcon one looks at the water dimension. This group here, we're looking at the PM 2.5 dimensions of doing a case study of just one particular plant. Certainly not sending a message that these plants are 100% clean by any stretch of the imagination. It's just the one slice that this particular research effort looked at, which that being said, does have interesting findings giving the general narrative. And with respect to the local air pollution, if you use all these technologies, Chinese coal plants are very different than the subcritical coal plants that some US firms are exporting around the world, and Japanese and South Koreans as well.
Right, and also the local environmental implications of a different factory in a different location matter. Port Qasim happens to be in a place advantageous for the wind direction and where the wind is blowing and where people are living. Now, in terms of another factory, if you looked at like the Thar coal fields up more in the desert, where they're going to perhaps mine lignite to then burn up there for electricity generation, the potential the local externalities in terms of land impacts from mining, pollution impacts from the mining processes itself, but also up there in terms of water withdrawals from groundwater and other sources in an area that is already very short on water. The local environmental implications of that factory might be quite different. That's where the site specifics matter.
Okay,
and maybe to Min's question about COVID, I'll just say, we couldn't detect any change because it's a model study, so we haven't done these aren't measurements, in real time, and so we wouldn't capture an effect like that. If we knew, I guess, whether people were drawing more or less energy because of sort of COVID-related restrictions, we might be able to remodel our scenario. But without knowing that, it would be hard to sort of estimate or even guess at what kind of change we would expect.
Actually, there was, I was reading that I think when COVID was hitting first, actually the power plant did reduce production or shut down briefly, or at least employees, they needed to figure out how to get employees back in safely. So there's a little bit of dip in production, I believe, back in the February, March period. But in terms of the long-term issues, it would be negligible.
Thanks. On Yemen's comment, yes, the previous government in Pakistan made choices about electricity, but I wouldn't say they made choices of electricity over health. If you look at our database, there's a family of Chinese finance power plants under the Belt Road Initiative. Some of them are wind and solar, some of them are coal. And if you look at the political discourse in Pakistan, the coal ones are getting a huge amount of pushback, both from local communities and from sort of folks in the cities just concerned about this kind of energy, and lots of international criticism such that there's a reevaluation. We also know there's a reevaluation of some of these coal plants happening right now on the China side. If you look at the economics of coal plants, when just looking at the meter, there's only a handful of countries where they're cost effective now, and even in South Asia, where there's a relative abundance of coal, you can't really find a model that'll show that these things will be cost effective past, say, 2028. And the lifetime of a coal plant is about 40 years. So all of these plants are going to be stranded assets. Pakistan's already has an International Monetary Fund program that they're very concerned about, and they've got the largest part of their debt distress is exposure to China under the Belt Road Initiative. China in Pakistan, like in many other countries around the world, and we'll talk more about this tomorrow, is in jeopardy of not being able to get the money back from all of these financing, partly because of COVID and the external shock of COVID and what it's done to the debt profiles of countries around the world. But in the case of coal plants, it's also accentuated over the intermediate term, because coal plants are stranded assets any coal plant that's been built in the past 2 or 3 years will not be profitable beyond, say, 2028. So there's a big change in the discourse on the Pakistan side, and this is one of the biggest issues in Beijing right now about the Belt Road Initiative, although the number one is the debt story. We have a couple more questions here. Let's do one. How about I'll ask a couple of these last ones here, and then if any of the authors want to make a final remark. So we have one from Aram Ashram from Swansea, United Kingdom. Says, your research findings seem to back Chinese government response to international criticism against the building of coal-fired power plants in BRI countries, that they are much more improved and not as much of an environmental hazard as in the past. Is my understanding of your findings correct, or have I missed something? Then we have a follow-up question from Yangisi Liu, sort of specific to Jeffrey, it looks like. Says, I think it would be really important to capture to some degree people's movement across cells. As you say, it's difficult, but maybe apply an exposure coefficient or STH to capture some of this. I think those are our, and then we have another one from Meiki Hindong. She's from Friends of the Earth Indonesia. And she says, Mikey says, was there also community tradition like burning trash or something like that, which I think can be related to the research result? Well, we can clarify there. We're modeling the plant and not all air pollution there. So comments from our panelists, and wrap in any closing remark that you'd like to make.
I think, thank you for the comment about movement of population. I think that's something we can look into further. In terms of burning trash or other major sources of PM 2.5 in the Karachi region, from some prior research that others have done, that we've read, it looks like traffic sources and also ocean sources. It turns out oceans kick off salt-related PM 2.5 into the local atmosphere. So traffic, sea salts, and then other domestic sources, which in some places for part of the year could be burning, are contributions to PM 2.5. That's why concentrations were in that 40, 50, 60 micrograms per cubic meter range in Karachi region. It's just that in terms of kind of this one specific power plant, it wasn't leading to large contributions. Now, if one expands this analysis out to all main industrial sources of PM 2.5 in the Karachi region, all of those contributions could add up to be quite a bit. And then the question could be thought in terms of strategies on different, perhaps retiring certain facilities, switching fuels from certain facilities and these kinds of things. But that will be for the future.
Any other comments, Arden, Jeffrey?
I actually, the point about trash burning is an interesting one. Those kinds of sources produce really nasty material into the atmosphere. And they also represent a source that in a lot of the world, we have no good constraints on. So in terms of understanding the global burden on health of those emissions, it's anyone's guess. But like Bruce said, we, I guess as Kevin said, our focus is just on this plant. But I think it's an excellent point to ask about.
To briefly build on the point that both Jeff, Kevin, and Bruce have all made, is that we focus primarily on PM 2.5 from this plant, but there are other chemical species being emitted, CO2, which for further analysis, we could look at other, say, ozone pollution or other types of pollution that have detrimental impacts on environmental and human health as well. But the focus primarily right now was PM 2.5, as explained because of the very known relationships between health and emissions.
Yeah, I'll just to answer Aram Ashraf's question. This is a case study of one plant, and it's hard to extrapolate across that. Although we do know when it comes to coal plants that vintage is an important part of the profile. And if you look at our database, the majority of China's overseas coal plants are generally in this vintage level technology class. And if you look at another paper we can put in the chat that we published with colleagues at Princeton University on the technology and the extent to which they're using ESPs, as reported in the World Economic Power Plant database, most Chinese plants are also reporting that they have ESPs within the plant. So we want to be careful to extrapolate across this, but it does appear that that the vintage of Chinese plants overseas is at a level nothing like those that you saw at the end of the last century, and when coupled with ESPs, you get relatively minimal or close to zero of PM 2.5. Not looking at CO2, published a lot on that. One of the biggest concerns in the global environment is the CO2 from coal-fired power plants. Not looking at water, but if you look at one of our fellows, Meyer Alkan, you'll see his paper on that. But here at the GDP Center and across this entire seminar, we've been trying to make a theoretically driven and data-driven approach to these kinds of issues. There's lots of narratives that folks who are less careful are drawing about Chinese overseas finance. And what we've shown in this seminar all across the semester, that it's much more nuanced than that. And this paper really contributes to that dialogue. With a theoretically driven and data-driven set of findings, which also have real policy implications with respect to the need for transparency. Hopefully we've provided a tool that can help others access some of that transparency, and need for real enforcement. I think one of the larger questions that's come across the seminar over the semester is that whose responsibility it is to do this, to the rules and enforcement. What we learned is that in the Belt Road Initiative thus far, China has what's referred to as a country systems approach, which many countries also have. What country systems approaches are that it is the responsibility of the Chinese financier or company to adhere to the host country standards. Other institutions such as the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank that operate in that region have concerns about the potential that host countries might not have those regulations, or when they do, they enforce them, in which cases those kinds of institutions such as the AIB and the ADB have their own sets of standards. They do their own EIAs and they have their own sets of transparency and so forth. This is a conversation that the Chinese government is starting to have, because they're realizing that when you rely on country systems, if those country systems aren't in place or they aren't enforced, many of these issues get out of hand, and they're hard to get a grip on. And China is one of the biggest globalizers at this level of development. They're only in GDP per capita at $10,000 GDP per capita, sort of amazing in a country so global at such time. And they're certainly learning by doing, to say the least. And one of the things that they've realized is outsourcing environmental impact analyses and all of these issues. One, creates another narrative out there that can hurt your ability to get new projects. And two, it's important for your own project level due diligence to find out what some of these things are. So one of the cross-cutting themes is an encouragement of China to sort of mimic some of these other international institutions to make sure that they can support local efforts and complement them when those local efforts aren't there. Before I thank our panelists, I really want to thank of all of you that are out there as attendees. I can look at the attendee list, and I think some of you have been season ticket holders. You've gone to every single one of these, and really want to appreciate everyone who's come today, especially the folks who've gone to almost every one of these seminars. We will be doing these again next semester, so please go. If you go to the chat here, you can click on and get on our newsletter so you can get emails and invitations about these kinds of seminars that'll happen next semester. But before next semester, you're all invited for our encore tomorrow, which is the unveiling of a new geospatial located database of all China Development Bank and Export-Import Bank projects across the world from 2008 to 2019. We'll have a demonstration of the database by Rebecca Ray and Blake Simmons on our team. I also really want to thank Bruce Larson, Arden Radford, and Jeffrey Geddes for a great presentation today. Folks, there'll be a short blog piece with an embedded video of today's presentation on the GDP Center webpage, which we'll tweet out so folks can get the bite-sized version of what we talked about today. So thanks everyone for coming. Sorry for those technological glitches in the beginning, and we'll see you tomorrow.